Hi, everybody. In this section, we'll be introducing biological psychology, which pairs with Chapter 3 in your textbook. Biological psychology focuses on the physical body as it relates to our behavior, experiences, feelings, thoughts, and so on and so forth. We'll be focusing a great deal on learning about the nervous system, including the brain, in this section. Here's the general outline for this section. We'll first talk about how information is conveyed through the nervous system and pay specific attention to how individual cells, called neurons, communicate with one another through an electrochemical process. We'll also talk about some of the major divisions along the way of the nervous system, and also about how there are different parts of the brain that are associated with different kinds of functions. We'll talk about the ways that scientists have used to measure brain activity or understand the different parts of the brain. And then lastly, talk a little bit about plasticity, which refers to how brains can grow and change. Some of the videos that I typically show in this lecture that you guys are asked to watch, the links are available on Blackboard, do show some brains under surgery. And so I just wanted to give you a heads up about this because it might make you feel a little bit squeamish if you're not used to it. Just a heads up about that. All right, so let's start with communication. The nervous system is defined as the body's electrochemical communication circuitry. And as shown here, the nervous system covers our entire body. And of course, this is to enable different parts of our body to send information about one another. There are different divisions of the nervous system. So the first major division is between the central nervous system, which includes the spinal cord and the brain. The other part of this division is the peripheral nervous system, which is everything else, all of the other nerves that are in your head and the rest of your body. In your head, there are some cranial nerves that connect directly to the brain. And in the rest of your body, the nerves that come out of the spinal cord connect to our sensory organs, our internal organs like the heart and adrenal glands and different various parts, and of course muscles too. So the peripheral nervous system controls the functioning of these parts and transmit information to and from the brain with different parts. Okay, let me talk a little bit about kind of a simplistic version of how communication works in the nervous system. First, there is sensory input, and by this I just mean information that's detected by your sensory organs. So your eyes, one type of sensory organ would respond to visual images and send that information up to be processed by the brain. What we mean here by processing it is that raw image, that raw data that is sent to the brain and detected by the visual cortex part of your brain has to be sent, that information has to be sent to other parts of the brain to fully comprehend what it is that you're seeing. Depending on the nature of the information that you're receiving and that is being processed, there may be a behavioral response that is then initiated. So let's talk about a concrete example for each of these sections. Say that you're driving and you see the light changing to red. Okay. So this is visual input, right? Sensory input that first occurs. You see the light, and in that third image there to the right, your eyes detect that image, and that information is sent to your brain via the optic nerve. The brain detecting that image, that information gets relayed to other parts of the brain. Okay, when you see that light, you might not necessarily recognize what it means. So parts of the brain that have functioning processes related to memory, recognition of different kinds of images might help you understand what it means to see that image. Okay, and then the brain then sends out, potentially, actually it should, in this scenario, information to appropriate parts of the brain for you to be able to step on the brake and stop your car. The frontal cortex, which is the kind of the pinkish red part in the front near the forehead, that part is associated with decision making. Perhaps that part is involved in the series of activities. That part may relay information to the primary motor cortex, which is involved in voluntary muscle movement. That information is then sent via the spinal cord eventually to your leg and foot to press on the brakes. So seeing a red light and stepping on the brake might sound like a relatively simple act to perform, but it does take a complicated series of steps in your body, and the nervous system takes an essential role in this process. Next, let's talk a little bit about how information is processed and relayed and shared within your brain, and specifically how individual cells in your brain talk to one another. Here we're talking about neurons, which make up your nervous system, and in your brain you have billions of neurons that compose your brain. So here are a couple of images that show these neurons. On the left, you see what we call a neural network, which is referring to a bunch of neurons being connected to one another. They, share information frequently with one another. The image on the right is further magnified, and the arrow points to an individual neuron. So it's starting to show individual cells. These are images of neurons from the brain, again, which are connected to one another. These are called interneurons. Interneurons are one type of neurons, and they just connect to other neurons. Your brain is composed of entirely of interneurons, but you also have different types of neurons as well. The sensory neurons, which are also called afferent neurons, connect to our sensory organs and transmit information from these organs to the brain. So it's taking in information from your surroundings. Motor neurons are connected to muscle tissue and respond to information sent from the brain. And so there are different types of neurons that serve different functions. When we talked earlier about the example of stopping at a red light, the image detected by your eyes are sent to the brain via sensory neurons, whereas information sent to your foot to press on the brake is sent via the motor neurons. Okay, now let's talk about how individual neurons communicate with one another by looking at a single neuron here with different parts of the neuron labeled. There are four main parts of the neuron that I'd like you to recognize. So first we have dendrites here, which kind of look like branches that come out from the cell body. The dendrites receive information from other neurons. You don't see it in this image. You see it on this to the right side, that these dendrites are connected to the terminal buttons of other preceding neurons. They receive messages from these preceding neurons in the form of chemical messengers that we call neurotransmitters. Next, the cell body. The cell body is kind of like the central office or the headquarters. It regulates the health of this entire cell, entire neuron, and it also integrates information received by the dendrites to determine whether there should be further relaying of the message. Next, the axon. The axon is this long tail that come out from the cell body, and on this image it looks like there are like blue sausages surrounding this tail. That's the myelin sheath. It's just a fatty cell that speeds up information conducted through the axon. The axon is where the action potential takes place. The action potential is an electrical charge that moves, from the cell body towards the terminal buttons there. The electrical charge is in the form of exchange of sodium and potassium ions. Okay? So when we said before that your nervous system is an electrical chemical circuitry, the action potential, that's the electrical part that we're referring to. There literally is electrical charges that are spreading throughout your brain as you think, move, do anything really, okay? The terminal buttons at the end of that single neuron are like these little nubbins that contain little pockets of neurotransmitters. So these are the parts, these little buttons are the parts that release those neurotransmitters. So this is the chemical part of that electrochemical circuitry. These neurotransmitters, after they're released, they cross a little gap. Okay, we call that the synaptic gap to reach the dendrites of another neuron. Here is a close-up of a terminal button, and at the bottom is a part of a dendrite of another neuron. Neurotransmitters that are released connect from the terminal button, connect to these little parts called receptor sites on the dendrite. We say that these neurotransmitters bind to the receptor sites like a key in a lock. Okay, there's certain combinations, certain neurotransmitters that only connect to certain kinds of receptor sites. So there must be a match between the two, okay, for there to be successful binding. So this is where the chemicals in the psychoactive drugs, the medications, etc., work to produce their effects. These drugs work on the functioning of these neurotransmitters. So some might mimic the effects of certain kinds of neurotransmitters we produce in our bodies. Others might prolong the effects of certain kinds of neurotransmitters, and still others might block neurotransmitters that currently exist from binding to these receptor sites. When you hear that there's a chemical imbalance in the brain, that's causing certain kinds of psychological symptoms, it's a reference to the neurotransmitters not functioning typically. So there are certain medications that attempt to correct this. And one example of that is the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Prozac is one of these. They basically work on the neurotransmitter serotonin and try to prolong its activity in the synaptic gap. There are lots of different kinds of neurotransmitters, and these are the ones that I'd like you to know, but there are currently at least 60 and more are being discovered. So acetylcholine is one that's involved in muscle movement and learning. One thing to note about these neurotransmitters is that each single one may have multiple functions that it's associated with. So acetylcholine, when you hear about people being paralyzed from exposure to poison, it's likely that the poison is affecting this neurotransmitter. Botox is actually one of those toxins that when medically injected, it has to be done in a very careful way. It results in freezing facial muscles. Norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter that promotes alertness. You may have also heard of epinephrine or noradrenaline and norepinephrine. They're the same things. Norepinephrine and epinephrine are different neurotransmitters, but they seem to have similar functions. Dopamine is another neurotransmitter that we talk about in the context of psychological disorders and with mood regulation. But it's also involved in voluntary movement and attention as well. Serotonin, I mentioned very briefly just a short while ago. It's involved in sleep, mood, and attention. And people suffering from symptoms of depression may be experiencing dysregulation of serotonin. So medications for depression often work regulating this specific neurotransmitter. Endorphins is the mashup of the word endogenous morphines. This is considered your natural painkiller that your body produces. We tend to produce this in states of pain, so it's like a natural analgesic. And lastly, oxytocin is involved in feelings of love, trust, and bonding with others. Parents of newborns experience an increase in oxytocin, which is adaptive, which is a good thing for their caring of their offspring.